Hi, we return to Genesis 10 today to look at the little story that's inserted within the genealogy here of Nimrod in Genesis 10, 8-12. And most scholars would attribute this to being a Yahwistic text, or non-P, as scholars tend to say, because as you can see on the left side of the screen, it uses Yahweh for God, as you can see in the all caps Lord there in verse 9. But that's not really the relevant point to our issue today. Our issue today is the portrayal of Nimrod supposed to be positive or negative, and what exactly is being said about his relationship with Yahweh and the places that he is said to be the beginning of. So there are a number of different translation issues, and curiously, the perspective on Nimrod as a character here and on this passage may have a lot to do with the presuppositions of scholarly authors as much as anything they can get about the text, as we'll see. Jewish authors from the past, experiencing foreign empires as oppressive, have often seen Nimrod as an evil representation of evil and domination, whereas Christian writers writing in the period of the early church after Jesus, but within the Roman imperial context, take empire as a given and often see Nimrod as a hero. So even scholars and people who could be described as quote-unquote saints can often let their presuppositions determine the meaning of the passage. So rather than do that, let's look closely at the language and the historical context to see what we can discern of what the Genesis authors are trying to say in this little story about Nimrod here. So as we can see, it's placed within the section of the sons of Ham. So Nimrod is coming from Cush, and as we can see here in verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. And if it just stopped there, it would fit within the genealogy, but of course it doesn't stop there. So there's a number of things we have to look at. First, we have to look at the language of verse 8. So to do that, let's use Bible Hub, as we've had sometimes, up on the screen to see some of the language in the Hebrew. And I know you probably can't read the Hebrew, but you can perhaps read the transliterations as we see here with the English, the Hebrew right to left, and then the transliteration Nimrod, of course, right there. So I'll use that at a number of places along the way. So Cush became the father of Nimrod. The name itself can suggest rebellion, or we shall rebel, from a related Hebrew word. So if one takes it that way, from Nimrod, only different in one letter, then it already is suggesting that there's some element of rebellion here. But that may or may not mean that, as scholars argue. He was the first, and here we have first Hechel, used a number of times, and of course in the primeval history section that we've been looking at here, there are many firsts, but this is an important first, as we'll see. There's another one in 11:6 in the Tower of Babel that we'll see next time. First on earth to become. The New Revised Standard here has mighty warrior, but the phrase is important to be looking at here. Can see from the Hebrew, he became a Gibor, and it's described simply as mighty here, not as a hunter as such. And yet the word is used again here, a Gibor Sa'id, and Sa'id is usually the word for hunter. So the question is, what does Gibor mean itself? Since there's only one word here translating mighty warrior and two words here describing mighty hunter, there's the question. We can see down here, Gibor Sa'id here, in verse 9, translated as mighty hunter. So we need to look at what Gibor was, and as Westermann notes, it is probably related to the Arabic gabar, meaning the idea of violent tyrannical power. And it was used in 6:4, let's go back to that one for a second here, about the Nephilim, who were described there as warriors of renown. Here's Anashi Hashem, men of the name, but here's hero is translating Gibborim here. So note that what's translated as mighty hunter in 10:8, back in 6:4 is simply translated as a hero. So there's really some question about what that term means. We're mostly going to learn it from context, and the context, as we're seeing, is other parts of the Hebrew Bible. And I won't go through all of these here, but plainly in these elements, like in Hannah's song at the beginning of 1 Samuel, and about David and Goliath, we're talking about warriors. So it seems pretty clear that Gibborim are warriors, and he's the first to be a warrior. And we're not sure how. It doesn't say how he became that, but he simply named that there. And then we come to the key verse 9. And I want to bring verse 9 up, as you can see here, because there's a number of translation issues. New Revised Standard has this: he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, simply repeating that. But if we look at some translations here, we can see what's at issue is, what is this relationship between Nimrod and Yahweh? And the phrase, there are a couple of phrases that are at issue here. One is before here, before the Lord, lifnei Yahweh. Literally, it's in the face of Yahweh, but very few authors take it as meaning that. The author, MKYH Hom, a woman, I don't know what her initials stand for, but we'll call her Dr. Hom here, reviews various historical interpretations of the term, and she notes that Christian authors such as Augustine influentially read it as against, instead of what had previously been common as before. The first century Jewish Greek writer Philo read the end of the verse, mighty hunter before Yahweh, as a giant before God, and therefore in opposition to God. But the 4th century Christian writer Chrysostom, writing in the post-Constantinian era, saw Nimrod as strong and brave and interpreted the phrase as, quote, created by God, receiving from him God's blessing. So we can see that although Augustine sees Nimrod as against, Chrysostom saw him as having been blessed by God. So when we look at these translations, of course, from the modern world, we see the same kind of split. So in the ones that are marked as blue, we see the neutral, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, which leaves open the interpretation of what is the relationship between Nimrod as a hunter and Yahweh as the Lord. But the good news breaks down the ambiguity and renders it on God's side. By the Lord's help, he was a great hunter. May the Lord make you as great a hunter as Nimrod. In other words, God is on the side of Nimrod as a hunter. The International Standard has a little different, a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. It's not clear why it's in defiance there, but they take Lifnei Yahweh as defiance. And the New American, a common version for Catholics, he was a mighty hunter in the eyes of the Lord. And therefore we're seeing it as Yahweh's perspective, as opposed to Nimrod doing something and Yahweh is just there in one form or another. This is suddenly given Yahweh's perspective, is that Nimrod's a mighty hunter. That's the first part of the verse. But I argue and come out my people that what happens if we take this more literally? That in the face of Yahweh highlights that Nimrod is in Yahweh's face, in the sense that he's confronting him with an alternative kingdom. And there's some evidence for that I'll show you in just a second. Notice how the English word confront means to put one's fronts together, to face somebody directly, whether that's in opposition or in truth. We'd see the same thing in sports, a face-off in hockey and that kind of thing where people stand against each other in competition for control. So I like to read it that way, although I can't say absolutely that's what it means. The word before gets translated in the Septuagint as enopian, which literally means like in the presence of or before, and is neutral in that sense. But there are a couple of things I'd suggest, in addition to the Jewish tradition we began to look at there already, and we'll see more of that in a minute, to suggest that this is an opposition, not with God's approval. Let's consider the work of Mordecai Bach, who reviews rabbinical views on Nimrod's character. And I have several of those here to give you a sense of a Jewish perspective. So from the great medieval commentator Rashi, who says, he, Nimrod, caused the whole world to rebel, Hebrew Limrod, that's the reference I was suggesting earlier about rebellion and a play on words, against God in the generation of the dispersion. Moreover, he, quote-unquote, hunted with his mouth in order to rebel against God. So he sees Nimrod as something like the sons of God we saw in chapter 6, as not necessarily like watchers or angels specifically. There's no question that Nimrod's portrayed as a human, but in rebellion against God. Another medieval Jewish commentator notes this: when people saw his great feats in hunting and killing animals, they feared him and venerated him and appointed him their king. But he abused this power. Whereas formerly there had been complete equality among people, Nimrod introduced a new system based on power. Rabbi Akiva, writing much earlier, and this is roughly in the time of the New Testament era, says, they threw off the yoke of heaven and appointed Nimrod over them, even though he was the son of a servant, the cursed Canaan, and woe to the land, excuse the typo there, that is ruled by a servant. So that from Rabbi Akiva. And then finally from Genesis Rabbah, Bach brings forward the quote, his quote here, the sages recognize that such archetypes as Nimrod exist in every age. So for the Jewish authors here, Nimrod is not so much a historical figure, but a characterization of human power amassed against God. And that's how I'm inclined to read it, but I do need to acknowledge that there are other aspects of that to pay attention to, as we'll see here. So the phrase like Nimrod here can be argued to associate Esau along with Nimrod as Cushite. From Psalm 7, we won't look in that detail now, but to highlight how people have tried to connect Nimrod with other historical figures to try to figure some of this out. So we get to verse 10 here, and I like that the way the chapters and verses are numbered. This is chapter 10, verse 10, and it's parallel to chapter 1, verse 1, because of this word here, beginning, Bereshit. And we can look at it from the Hebrew directly here and see that the beginning beginning, Bereshit, Rashit here, the ba at the beginning in Genesis 1 is the in part, in the beginning. So simply Rashit, the beginning, and it's only in these two places and one other as a sense of firstborn of Jacob's sons. So there's the beginning of God's creating, and there's the beginning of Nimrod's counter-creating of a kingdom. Mamlakto here, only chapter 20, verse 9, elsewhere in Genesis. The Greek renders it as basileus, which is the standard word for kingdom, as in the kingdom of God in the New Testament, but also the kingdom of Caesar, like in Luke's Gospel and other places. So we're plainly talking about a mighty hunter who is powerful enough to become a kingdom builder and a city builder. And one could ask, as scholars have, is there any relationship to history here? Not that Nimrod is a historical figure as such, although people have tried to argue that, but whether this is a play, like so much of Genesis, on the Assyrian or Babylonian stories. And one scholar to work on that is Terry Fenton, whose article I cite down here, Nimrod Cities, an item from the Rolling Corpus, in this book, Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms. And he argues the story may be a play on the Assyrian god Ninurta, and he's summarizing an argument from other scholars, so it's not his original idea. And that the phrase in verse 9, Lifnei Yahweh, as we've seen here in the face of Yahweh, constitutes a statement that Nimrod, Ninurta, is no god. So in that sense, he focuses on the presence of Yahweh as the key thing here. Whatever human power there is, it comes from and is under the control of Yahweh. He also notes something about the names here, and that's what we need to turn to here, because the beginning of his kingdom is described in the new RSV as 3 cities here, all in the land of Shinar, and then into Assyria, and then we see Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Kala, and Rezin, 4 cities and then Rezin described as between Nineveh and Kala. And there's a number of problems with that, so let's look more slowly at that. As Fenton notes in general about trying to understand the cultural context of the author, he says, the first 3 names of verse 10 reflect some acquaintance with the ancient and contemporary Babylonian culture, but not expertise, and this in the 8th or 7th century. But I want to argue, if this is an exilic author, as I've been trying to argue all along, with the Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh epic and other Assyrian and Babylonian texts right around them while they're in Babylon, it doesn't require someone in Jerusalem knowing about this distant kingdom. It can well be that people who are right there working for the kingdom of Babylon and probably have the archives right around them are aware of it directly here. So we don't have to rely on 7th or 8th century expertise. We can imagine this as an exilic text. So we need to look at each of these things. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and of course that represents Babylon, and yet in the period in the 7th or 8th century where Fenton suggests that the text might have been written, Babylon was not a great city at that point. It had been in the first Babylonian Empire, and it became one again, but at this point Nineveh was more the greater city, with Assyria reigning more strongly in the Mesopotamian than Babylon in that period. Erech here is an English transliteration of the Hebrew of Uruk, of the Akkadian word Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh on the Euphrates, about 125 miles southeast of Babylon. And there's a lot can be said about that. So Babel and Uruk, and we can see this on the map here, so that we can look at this in actual places. So here's the Assyrian places up here, and here's the Babylonian places right here. All of them in the land of Shinar. And Shinar is named here as that, and we see it in these places in Genesis and a few other places, all exilic or post-exilic texts, also suggesting that our text is from that time period when Shinar was a name for Babylon. And Wenham notes that Shinar is not used in Mesopotamian texts to refer to the area, but it is in Egyptian, Hittite, and Alamarna documents for the Kassite kingdom of Babylon, possibly derived from an archaic pronunciation of Sumer, but that's a guess. So we have these 3 cities. I didn't note Akkad yet. It was founded by Sargon I, the Sumerian king, the predecessors to the Babylonians and the Assyrians, long before our time period, and had originally been the capital, but as Westermann notes, was of no importance in the first millennium. The writer apparently learned that it was the seat of the first great Mesopotamian empire. This actually, now I think of it, is not from Westermann. This is from Fenton, the author I was using about the cities earlier. Then we have to look at this phrase, all of them, because what the text actually says, again, let's go back and look at the text itself here in verse 10, is Kalna, and Kalna here, but New Revised Standard has all of them. And as my note says, and this is taken from the earlier 20th century scholar Albright, who read this as Kalana rather than Kalna. so interpreting it as all of them rather than the name of a fourth city. Although, as Fenton notes, Babylonian texts often had sets of 4 cities. So 4 cities would make sense if this is being written in parallel with the Babylonians, but on the other hand, 3 cities in verse 10 and 3 cities in verse 11 would also be parallel. So most scholars have accepted Albright's interpretation that the word should be Kalana rather than Kalna there, and hence all 3 cities in the land of Shinar. And that takes us into the 3 Assyrian cities that match the 3 Babylonian cities. From there he went into Assyria here, and again I'll put the map up so we can see that, and built Nineveh, which is plainly the great city as described in Jonah. And the only other time the phrase "the great city" is used in the Hebrew Bible is about Jerusalem in the book of Jeremiah, as we'll see in just a moment. So built Nineveh, Kala, and Resen. And the issue is Rehoboth-ir here. Although Rehoboth is a city in the U.S. state of Delaware now, what the phrase literally means is city squares, and many scholars have noted it probably means a suburb or the outlying districts of Nineveh. So it would mean Nineveh and its surrounding cities, Kala and Rezon. So again, 3 cities matching 3 cities. Kala here was the capital of Assyria in the 9th century. It had moved from Nineveh, but was not a great city by the time of exile in the 6th century. Resen is an unknown place exactly, and we see it's not really, don't see it on this map because scholars don't know what it refers to. The word probably comes from the Akkadian res-eni, meaning fountainhead, but it can fit several known places in Assyria, and none of them are between Nineveh and Kala. So that's suggesting that it's not the rendition we see in the New Revised Standard that suggests it's the great city between Nineveh and Kala can't be right. It may be right based on the Hebrew, but it can't be right in terms of actual history and geography, suggesting the text has become corrupt in some way. Jacques Ellul, who is not so much interested in these kind of historical facts, but interested in how the Bible shows power, notes that the root meaning in the Hebrew means bridle, and links it, and the quote from him is, with the first force of nature domesticated by man and put into service, which is to say, horses and animals, and especially horses that were war horses. And then we get to this phrase, the great city. So here's the reference I said in Jeremiah to Jerusalem as the great city, and then here's the references to Jonah as the great references in Jonah to Nineveh as the great city. And the only other place we see it is in the book of Revelation, where it refers to Babylon, the symbolic Babylon, as the great city, and likened as well as to other great cities like Jerusalem. As well as to things that are not cities like Egypt, which we see right after this. So perhaps our author, John of Patmos, had this passage in mind. He certainly had Hebrew Scripture in mind, as we've seen in the Revelation series in this program as well. So what is it we're seeing here about Nimrod, and why the authors have put this section in the midst of this genealogy here? I'm suggesting that when we look at this all together, and we'll see more evidence when we look at the Tower of Babel, which many scholars link chapter 10 and that first part of chapter 11, as I noted in the last video, the overview of the whole table of nations, that what we're seeing here is the beginning of the world that Israel comes to be in. That God in Genesis 1 made all of creation and gave it to humans as a gift, but as we've seen in the chapters up till now, humans spurned the gift and ruined it, corrupted it, made it violent, and the flood didn't change any of that. And so now in this world after the flood, people are starting their own beginning on this blank slate of the new revised earth. And so as God has made a created kingdom of plants and animals, as well as angels and other creatures in the sky, humans now are building a counter kingdom. And this is the world of opposition the Israelites will find themselves in, and this is why so much of the rabbinical commentary, as opposed to the Christian commentary, recognizes what I'm suggesting is the meaning of it here, that Nimrod is an opponent of God, and that all human empires are opponents of God. We'll see that in its extreme and apocalyptic texts like the book of Daniel, where the leaders of human kingdoms are not even said to be human when seen from God's perspective, but are seen as beasts, and are eventually replaced as one like a human being, often translated as the Son of Man, or the human one, which is to say someone who does rule in the image of God and whose power is from the God of creation. But here Nimrod isn't said to have power from God except by translations that presume that this kind of power is part of God's will. But Genesis is not on that side. Genesis is clearly showing with the beginning of the first city from Cain, and we'll see with Sodom and Gomorrah coming up in just a few chapters, that cities are the place of domination and violence, and it's God's call to God's people, anybody, whether that's Israelites or anybody else, to come out of those places, and if one is in them, and to avoid those places if one is out of them. So we'll see this paradigm throughout, not just throughout Genesis, but throughout the Hebrew Bible, of human-made kingdoms in opposition to what Jesus will call the kingdom of God. And now we'll pick the story up in Genesis 11 as we see the wonderful and hilariously funny satire Tower of Babel story. See you then. Bye-bye.